RAF Linton-on-Ouse, Yorkshire, December 1941. The night air hangs heavy with frost. Across the dispersal field, the silhouettes of Handley Page Halifaxes stand in silence, their dark fuselages glinting faintly beneath the blackout lamps. Ground crews move like shadows, boots crunching through hoarfrost, breath steaming in the cold. Inside a draughty maintenance shed, a mechanic crouches beside a line of fuel drums. Each one bears the stenciled mark 100 octane avgas. Precious, tightly rationed, and monitored by the Ministry of Aircraft Production. Yet tonight, beneath the hum of a single paraffin lamp, he is measuring something else, a blend. A careful ratio of high-grade additives siphoned from an auxiliary tank, mixed by hand into the bomber's fuel supply. It is a risk. Technically unauthorized, potentially catastrophic, but if it works, the squadron's Halifaxes might carry their bomb loads beyond the old limit, to Berlin itself, and back. The mechanic straightens, wiping cold fuel from his gloves as an engine coughs to life outside. In the distance, a red lamp winks twice, the signal to start fueling. That small decision will soon echo across the night sky. By the winter of 1941, Britain's war had entered a darker, more demanding phase. The Blitz had subsided, but the offensive was far from over. The Royal Air Force, under the leadership of Air Marshal Sir Richard Pearse, sought to take the war directly to Germany, to strike at its industrial heartlands and, most symbolically of all, its capital, Berlin. Reaching it was the great test of Britain's bomber force. The distance, more than 600 miles each way, pressed the limits of aircraft design and fuel endurance. The early twin-engined Whitleys and Wellingtons had barely managed the journey, often forced to jettison bombs or divert to coastal fields on the return. Even with the arrival of four-engined Halifaxes and Sterlings, fuel remained the defining constraint. Each aircraft carried an enormous burden: bomb load, crew armor, and the demands of climbing to operational altitude. Every additional gallon of fuel meant a reduction in explosives carried. Every kilogram of bomb load meant less range. The arithmetic of war, brutal and precise. The RAF's bomber stations across Yorkshire and Lincolnshire became laboratories of endurance. Engineers and armorers worked side by side, measuring, trimming, recalculating. Crews reported home with tales of engines coughing dry just short of the coast. One Halifax, returning from Berlin, had run out entirely and glided to an emergency landing on the North Sea mudflats. Its tanks were found bone dry. Official doctrine from the Air Ministry allowed no deviation from standard fuel mixtures. The 100-octane aviation spirit was among Britain's most precious commodities, refined to exacting standards, in a global supply network that stretched from the refineries of Aruba and Bahrain to storage tanks in Merseyside and Teesside. Fuel adulteration, even minor, risked detonation, misfire, or outright engine failure. For Rolls-Royce and Bristol, whose Merlin and Hercules engines powered the RAF's heavy bombers, the fuel composition was non-negotiable. Yet in practice, wartime necessity bred quiet defiance. Mechanics knew the aircraft as intimately as surgeons knew anatomy. They could tell from a sound, from the color of exhaust flame, when an engine was running lean or rich. Many had served since the days of biplanes. They trusted their judgment as much as any manual, and they understood that a few extra miles could mean the difference between a crew's survival and their disappearance over the North Sea. At stations like Linton-on-Ouse, Elsham Wolds, and Waddington, unofficial methods began to circulate. Adjusting mixture ratios, preheating tanks, using trace amounts of higher-octane additives, originally intended for fighter engines, to extract marginal gains in efficiency. None of it recorded, all of it deniable. By late 1941, Bomber Command's raids on Berlin had become a test not only of courage, but of chemistry. The official range tables said the Halifaxes could reach the city and return only under ideal conditions. The reality was far harsher: headwinds, ice, damaged fuel lines, or the simple act of flying evasive courses could consume hundreds of gallons more than planned. Crews improvised by throttling back during the climb or gliding where possible, but the margins were perilously thin. It was in that context, cold, secretive, and under immense operational pressure, that one ground crewman took his own initiative. In the eyes of the law, it was an infraction. In the eyes of the air crews, it was an act of courage. His fuel mix, modest in proportion and measured by instinct, would quietly alter the equation of range. Britain's war in the air was becoming not just a contest of strength, but of ingenuity, of unseen minds solving unseen problems beneath the roar of engines. The strategic logic of striking Berlin went beyond symbolism. By late 1941, Churchill and the chiefs of staff viewed the bombing offensive as Britain's only direct means of carrying the war into Germany's heart. The army was not yet in a position to mount a continental return. The Royal Navy held the seas but could not bring the Reich to its knees. Only the RAF possessed the means to reach across Europe. The policy, formalized under the Air Staff's Directive No. 4, authorized disruption of German industrial, administrative, and civil morale centers. Berlin represented all three, yet it also sat more than 6 hours' flight from most British bases, deep within enemy-controlled territory, surrounded by night fighter belts and flak corridors that glowed like iron chains across the map. For air crews, it was the most demanding assignment imaginable. Takeoff often came after dusk, with crews navigating by dead reckoning and radio beacons. The air above the North Sea was unforgiving, black, turbulent, and marked by sheets of ice. Over the continent, German radar stations tracked every approach. Crews spoke of watching their fuel gauges fall faster than the minutes passed. The human toll was immense. Of the men who set out for Berlin during the winter of 1941-42, nearly 1 in 4 did not return. Some were seen ditching in the sea. Others vanished altogether. The fuel shortage was not merely an inconvenience. It was a recurring sentence of death. At bases like RAF Elsham-Wolds and Linton-on-Ouse, the tension between engineering instruction and operational reality reached breaking point. The Air Ministry's technical branch, wary of contamination and engine failure, enforced rigid limits on fuel handling. Each tank was sealed, each sample checked. Yet those working the night shifts knew that adherence to regulations could mean sending men to their deaths for want of another 10 minutes flight time. So, quietly, some began to bend the rules. Among those whispered methods was the addition of a minute proportion of aromatic hydrocarbons and compounds derived from toluene and benzene, scavenged from stores reserved for high-performance fighter fuel. When blended with the standard 100-octane aviation spirit, these additives altered combustion characteristics, improving volatility and energy release at altitude. It was dangerous chemistry, but within the range of what experienced fitters could handle. The RAF's Merlin and Hercules engines were marvels of precision, but they were also temperamental. Their performance varied with air density, temperature, and even the quality of local refueling equipment. Ground crews would often drain samples to inspect color and clarity, noting faint shifts that hinted at improper storage or condensation. Over time, this attentiveness bred a kind of mechanical intuition, a sense that the machine itself communicated when it was being starved or overfed. As the bomber war intensified, that intuition became a quiet rebellion. The mechanics worked not for recognition but for survival, theirs and the crew's. Reports from squadrons indicated small yet measurable improvements. Bombers returning with 20, sometimes 30 gallons to spare. A handful even reported shaving minutes off flight times without overheating or detonation. None of it was recorded officially, but word traveled through the hangars and mess halls like a rumor of salvation. The RAF's hierarchy remained unaware, or simply chose not to look too closely. Bomber Command's Commander-in-Chief, Sir Richard Pearse, was under immense political pressure to deliver results. Churchill, ever impatient for offensive action, demanded visible retaliation for the Blitz. In February 1942, Arthur Harris assumed to become Bomber Harris and took command, vowing to intensify the assault on Germany's cities. The clandestine modifications that emerged in those months were, in their own way, acts of defiance against limitation. They revealed something fundamental about Britain's wartime spirit, an unwillingness to accept the given boundaries of machinery or policy. It was in this crucible of necessity, fatigue, and quiet genius that a mechanic's so-called illegal mixture proved itself. A small, unauthorized deviation, a precise dash of high aromatic additive, mixed by hand in the shadows of a hangar, extended the reach of British bombers just enough to return from the heart of Germany. For those who flew, it meant life. For those who stayed behind, it meant the silent satisfaction of having pushed back the limits of what was thought possible. From this secret chemistry of survival, the RAF's campaign evolved. one quiet modification at a time. In wartime, expertise is seldom theatrical. It is quiet, practical, and learned through repetition. The mechanic who mixed that illicit dash of additive was not a rogue alchemist. He was a tradesman shaped by apprenticeship, rationing, and long nights in cold sheds. He had oil under his fingernails and a memory for engines that sounded like a language. He knew by ear and by touch when a Merlin coughed or a Hercules sang true. The bomber crew, in turn, lived by trust. They trusted each other's navigation and courage. They trusted their skipper's judgment at flares and cloud breaks. And crucially, they trusted the men who tended the aircraft. A mechanic's quiet intervention, an extra measure in a fuel drum, a preheated tank on a frosty morning, was a vote of faith. It said, "We will do what we must to bring you back." There was moral weight to such acts. To tamper with fuel was to flirt with catastrophe. Detonation, seizure, a fire at altitude. Yet the calculus of risk was immediate and visceral. A few more miles of range might mean reaching friendly airspace. A few more minutes could mean an exhausted navigator finding the beacon at Lincolnshire, rather than the cold North Sea. The mechanic's choice was both technical and humane, an engineering judgment shaped by the knowledge that each flight carried human lives as payload in mess halls and on dispersals. The story moved by hushed approval, not boastfulness. The men involved expected no commendation. Their reward was different. The sight of an aircraft returning intact, the relief that tightened the air for a moment. That was enough. Strategic bombing is an exercise in arithmetic and compromise. An aircraft's range is not a single number but a negotiation between fuel, payload, altitude, and enemy action. For Bomber Command to reach Berlin, planners had to choose where to sacrifice. Fewer bombs for more fuel, lower altitude for efficiency but greater vulnerability, or complex routing that added miles but avoided flak. Every tactical decision carried human cost. A reduction of payload might spare fuel but reduce the raid's efficacy. A heavier fuel load could bring crews home, but leave fewer tons to damage the target. The bomber leader's brief was therefore full of trade-offs, and the maintenance shed's margins were part of that equation. A small increase in specific energy from the fuel could shift that balance. If a bomber returned with less consumption, squadrons could either carry a marginally larger bomb load or extend their radius by the same amount, an invaluable tactical flexibility. In the fog of night over occupied Europe, those mathematical fractions became operational advantage. Moreover, tactical improvisation at base level could change doctrine. When crews and mechanics demonstrated repeatable gains, squadron commanders adapted. Flight plans were altered to exploit new endurance windows. Routes were redrawn to test limits. Thus, a mechanic's empirical adjustment, humble in scale, could ripple into squadron-level tactics, altering how raids were planned and executed. A Merlin or a Hercules is an exacting companion. Its appetite, compression ratio, and timing respond to octane, volatility, and the presence of aromatic compounds. Aviation spirit in wartime Britain was strictly specified. Blends refined for altitude and engine tolerances, manufactured to measured standards far from improvised tinkering. Additives, toluene, benzene derivatives, other aromatics, alter combustion by raising effective octane and changing flame speed. Used sparingly and with knowledge, they can reduce knock and improve power output at altitude. Used recklessly, they can ignite prematurely or foul valves. The mechanics who blended by hand operated in that narrow corridor between benefit and breakdown. Practical measures accompanied chemical ones. Preheating tanks in frigid conditions prevented vapor lock. Careful draining of condensation and simple filtration avoided water contamination. The combination of chemistry, experience, and attention to basic fuel hygiene yielded the marginal efficiency gains that mattered. Crucially, these were not grand technological revolutions. They were incremental refinements, the sort of small repeatable advantage that engineers call robust. They could be executed at scale only if they proved reliable. That reliability in turn depended not on secrecy but on tacit knowledge. The way an engine's note altered with a change in mixture, the smell of exhaust that suggested detonation risk. In short, technology here was as much human apprenticeship as it was laboratory science. Within Bomber Command, the chain of authority was both rigid and quietly porous. Orders flowed down from the Air Ministry with mathematical precision. directives on load, altitude, and fuel allocation. Yet beneath that structure lived a world of human discretion. Senior officers often knew of minor adjustments at squadron level, but looked the other way, so long as results justified the risk. Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, appointed Commander-in-Chief in early 1942, demanded relentless pressure upon the enemy. "They sowed the wind," he famously declared, "and now they are going to reap the whirlwind." His focus was destructive power and operational reach. If an aircraft could hit Berlin and return, its means were of lesser concern, provided it did not endanger the force or compromise reliability. Squadron leaders faced a moral and administrative dilemma. To sanction unapproved modifications was to breach regulations and endanger their commissions. To forbid them could be to deny their men the chance of survival. Many adopted the stance of deliberate ignorance, neither confirming nor forbidding, merely permitting the culture of adaptation to continue in silence. The RAF's institutional genius lay in this tension, central authority balanced by peripheral initiative. Commanders issued orders in accordance with policy. Those below interpreted them in accordance with necessity. That interplay of discipline and improvisation became one of Britain's quiet strengths. The illegal fuel blend thus existed within an unofficial covenant. Never acknowledged, never denied, yet undeniably effective. Wartime morality is never simple. In the maintenance hangars of Bomber Command, obedience to procedure could cost lives while defiance could save them. The Air Ministry's regulations on fuel purity and maintenance were written to preserve aircraft and prevent mechanical failure. Rules born of science, not bureaucracy. Yet war often demands that rules bend before necessity. The men who tampered with fuel knew the stakes. A miscalculation could destroy an aircraft and crew. The act was, by regulation, sabotage. But they also knew that the official supply chain was imperfect, that losses over the North Sea, engines failing on approach, were part of a pattern solvable only from within the workshops themselves. In moral terms, their defiance was not rebellion but stewardship. They were custodians of machinery and lives, acting not in defiance of Britain's cause but in devotion to it. There was quiet courage in such acts. No medals, no public recognition, only the silent conviction that doing the right thing might mean breaking a rule. After the war, few spoke of these modifications. Wartime secrecy and post-war professionalism forbade it. Yet historians reviewing squadron, logs at the National Archives and the RAF Museum, have noted unexplained improvements in range and endurance during the winter of 1941 to 42, anomalies that speak of human initiative beyond recorded orders. In those figures lies a truth about Britain's war. It was not won by regulations alone, but by the conscience and ingenuity of those who bent them for survival. The illegal mixture was not an isolated event. It was part of a national temperament that defined Britain's wartime conduct. Across the services, adaptation became instinct. At Bletchley Park, mathematicians turned ciphers into vulnerabilities. At the radar stations of the chain home network, engineers repurposed equipment for new frequencies. In the shipyards of Belfast and the foundries of Derby, shortages of alloy or labor were met with improvised substitutes that somehow held the line. The same mindset lived in the bomber stations. The British genius during the Second World War was not for flamboyant invention, but for constant adjustment. A culture that prized problem-solving over obedience. It was as true for a mechanic mixing fuel as for a scientist tuning radar circuits. This pattern of ingenuity also reflected Britain's industrial democracy. The sense that skilled labor carried both responsibility and authority. A corporal fitter or sergeant engineer, if experienced enough, could hold the fate of an entire crew in his hands. The war blurred social hierarchies. Knowledge, not rank, became the currency of survival. In that way, the Mechanics Act symbolized a greater truth. It was the embodiment of a national ethos, a quiet, methodical refusal to accept limitation, expressed through the practical arts of craftsmanship and courage. The stage was set. Across airfields from Lincolnshire to Yorkshire, bombers stood ready for the longest nights. Inside their tanks, perhaps a trace of something unrecorded. The difference between regulation and invention measured only in miles and lives. The night began like so many others. Cold, still, the smell of fuel and hydraulic oil hanging in the air. Frost shimmered across the dispersal, catching the yellow gleam of inspection lamps. Ground crews moved in silence, gloved hands on frozen metal. Engines stood dormant, their black cowlings rimed with ice. The target once again was Berlin. The crews filed out of briefing huts, their flight bags heavy with maps and rations. The mechanics followed quieter, burdened by another kind of weight. The responsibility that each aircraft left the ground ready for the longest of all journeys. In the shadows behind a parked Halifax, one man worked alone with a steel funnel and a jerry can marked for fighter use only. Inside it, a few liters of toluene-rich additive. He poured, measured by eye, then stirred the mix into the aircraft's tank. No one spoke. It was an act of trust between men who would never admit what they had seen. At 18:30, the first engines turned. The sound rose from a dull chug to a clean, resonant thrum. 8 Halifax bombers of No. 103 Squadron began to taxi down the perimeter track, their navigation lights ghostly in the fog. From the tower, the control officer noted the wind. Calm. Variable at 2 knots. Good conditions for range. For the crews, Berlin meant a 10-hour round trip, across the North Sea, over the Zuiderzee, then deep into the heart of Germany. Any miscalculation in fuel load meant one outcome: the cold black water of the return leg. By 22:40, they were over the target. The city lay beneath them, smothered in smoke and flame, flak bursts climbing through the darkness like phosphorus blossoms. The lead navigator recorded hits along the railway yards at Tempelhof. Engines strained under full boost, fuel gauges beginning their slow descent. At 02:10, the first aircraft turned for home. Over Magdeburg, 1 Halifax reported engine hesitation. Normally, such signs meant trouble, fuel cavitation, mixture faults, or simply exhaustion. But the gauges held steady, a fraction slower than expected. The crew pressed on. By dawn, radio calls crackled back to Elsham Wolds. Crossing the coast. Landing at base. One after another, bombers returned, their fuel readings hovering just above zero but not empty. Every aircraft that had carried the altered blend had made it back. The mechanics gathered wordlessly at dispersal. They watched as the last bomber taxied to a halt, its engines idling low before cutting out in unison. From the cockpit emerged the crew, exhausted, eyes red with fatigue, but alive. They offered no questions about what had changed, only nods of gratitude. For the engineer who had made the decision, unrecorded, unauthorized, and invisible to command, the proof was in the sound of those returning engines. He had stretched the possible by inches, but those inches bridged a continent. The technical reports that followed that night showed anomalies. Endurance records exceeded expectations by a narrow yet statistically significant margin. Squadron logs marked them down as favorable conditions, yet inside the workshops men exchanged quiet glances. They knew better. The adjustment was repeated in subsequent operations, always in secret, always in moderation. By March, multiple squadrons across Bomber Command's northern group had begun to record similar improvements, fuel margins that allowed safer returns from Berlin, Essen, and Cologne. No accidents, no recorded detonations, just results. What made this moment a turning point was not the chemistry alone, but what it represented. The night of February 15, 1942, marked the convergence of frontline necessity and engineering intuition, a microcosm of Britain's wartime innovation. It was not invention in a laboratory, but discovery through courage. In purely operational terms, the gain was modest, a few percentage points of range, perhaps 100 miles of margin. But those miles changed the mental arithmetic of the war. It meant planners could order deeper penetrations without condemning crews to near certain loss. It meant that Berlin was no longer a theoretical target, but a practical one. Harris's offensive intensified in the months that followed. The 1,000 bomber raids were still to come, but the groundwork, logistical, psychological, and mechanical, was being laid by acts just like this. Each small success reinforced the belief that British air power could reach anywhere, at any cost. And behind that belief stood men in overalls, not medals, the quiet engineers who dared to make the impossible fractionally more possible. As spring came, the skies above Europe grew busier. The nights shortened, but the missions lengthened. Each aircraft that roared into the dark carried not only its bomb load, but the hidden legacy of that unauthorized experiment. It was a quiet revolution, conducted with funnels and wrenches rather than blueprints or laboratories. By April 1942, Bomber Command's confidence had hardened into resolve. The campaign against Germany's industrial and administrative heartlands gathered pace. With each new operation, range and endurance became the silent determinants of survival. The illegal mixture, whispered from one dispersal hut to another, had become part of an unspoken fraternity of knowledge. At RAF Linton-on-Ouse, one Sergeant Fitter was overheard advising a colleague to give it the touch. No records, no paper trail, only trust between craftsmen. To an outsider, the hangars looked no different. The same clatter of tools, the same lines of ground crew hauling hoses across the frost. Yet in the hearts of the engines they serviced, something unseen had changed. As sorties extended deeper into Germany, the evidence became undeniable. In squadron after squadron, crews returned with a few gallons more than expected, enough to reduce the terrifying probability of ditching in the North Sea. These marginal returns, repeated across dozens of raids, translated into lives saved and aircraft preserved. Still, secrecy was absolute. The Air Ministry could not be informed. To admit that operational performance depended on an unsanctioned modification would have been to acknowledge a systemic failure. Moreover, the chemistry involved, the use of high aromatic components drawn from limited fighter reserves, risked compromising the already delicate supply network. Yet the field workshops persisted. They worked by intuition, adjusting ratios according to temperature, altitude, and aircraft type. Their notes, if they existed at all, were written on scraps of paper soon burned in waste drums. What remained was tacit memory, the kind of knowledge that survives only through repetition and mentorship. In mid-May, a squadron from RAF Pocklington executed a raid on the synthetic oil plants at Gelsenkirchen. It was a punishing distance compounded by headwinds on the return leg. 5 aircraft carried the enhanced mixture, blended under supervision of a senior engineering officer known for his caution rather than daring. The result astonished him. Despite adverse conditions, all 5 bombers returned, some with as much as 50 gallons remaining. Their flight logs showed smoother engine response at cruising altitude and no increase in operating temperature. In post-sortie checks, spark plugs and valves were clean. No signs of carbon fouling or detonation damage. The data filtered quietly upward. Squadron engineering officers compared results through informal channels, over mess tables, through coded references in maintenance forms. The conclusion was inescapable. The fuel adjustment worked. It was efficient, repeatable, and safe within narrow margins. The innovation soon met its ethical boundary. When one officer proposed requesting official evaluation, he was discouraged by his superior. "Best left where it is," came the reply. "It's doing more good than harm, and we'll keep it that way." That exchange encapsulated the paradox of British wartime ingenuity. Progress hidden beneath secrecy, achievement cloaked in modesty. No one sought ownership. The act itself was its own vindication. The decisive test came during the first large-scale raids on Cologne in May 1942, the opening salvo of what Harris would soon call the 1,000-bomber offensive. It was a demonstration, not only of force but of logistics, requiring the maximum range from every aircraft. On those nights, the new fuel practices quietly underpinned the offensive's success. Aircraft returned battered, riddled with flak, yet their engines had endured. The engineers knew, though none would ever be cited in dispatches, that their improvised chemistry had become part of Britain's strategic reach. The shift was subtle yet profound. For the first time, bomber crews began to believe that their machines could take them to Germany's farthest cities and bring them home. That belief, as much psychological as technical, altered morale across the command. From the hangars of Lincolnshire to the control rooms of High Wycombe, Britain's offensive capacity had been stretched by human hands that would never appear in the records. In the war's broader history, this episode would remain unspoken. The Air Ministry's post-war reports make no mention of unauthorized modifications to aviation fuel. The data exists only in anomalies, patterns of endurance that exceed theoretical capacity, logged by crews who themselves did not understand the reason. But for those who were there, the memory endured. The sound of engines returning from impossible distances, the smell of fuel in the hangar air, sharper, faintly sweeter than standard spirit. The quiet satisfaction of knowing they had defied regulation not for vanity, but for life. That winter and spring marked the transition from survival to confidence. The RAF had proven that it could reach the enemy's heartland and return, and behind that achievement lay an act of unrecorded courage. A handful of men who mixed faith with chemistry and changed the range of history. The war would carry on for 3 more years. Berlin would burn under heavier raids, and new engines, new fuels, and new bombers would take to the skies. But in that frozen season of 1942, Britain's endurance turned on the judgment of men who trusted their hands more than the rulebook. From that moment onward, no flight to Berlin would be thought impossible. When the sun rose over Lincolnshire on the morning of 31st of May 1942, the runways of Bomber Command were littered with exhausted men and scarred aircraft. The first 1,000 bomber raid on Cologne had been declared a success. For the British public, it was a moment of triumph, proof that the RAF could strike deep into Germany, that the offensive spirit had not been extinguished by the Blitz. But beneath the headlines, inside the hangars and dispersals, the real victory was quieter. The mechanical adjustments, the clandestine chemistry had held. Every engine that ran through that night had consumed the invisible labor of those who refused to accept limitation. After the Cologne raid came Essen, Bremen, and Dusseldorf. The bombers flew farther, heavier and higher than any official range tables had suggested. For the first time, the strategic bombing campaign could sustain momentum without crippling losses to fuel exhaustion. Engineers spoke in code, the long blend and the high mix and with a special brew, but the meaning was clear. Britain's bombers were now operating beyond their designed capacity. Official recognition never came. In the bureaucracy of war, no report could acknowledge an act that violated the Air Ministry's own technical orders. Yet squadron engineering officers began to notice an indirect shift. Aircrew reports of fuel anxiety, those dreaded end-of-flight notes describing engines dying within sight of the coast, declined sharply in the spring and summer of 1942. At Elsham Wolds, the senior maintenance officer quietly updated his ledger. In a column marked fuel remainder, he entered an average figure of 4.8%. Before the modification, it had been less than 2%. A difference invisible to history but vital to survival. The shift also affected planning. With greater operational range, the air staff could reconsider routes and targets. Berlin, once at the very edge of possibility, was now routinely included in bombing plans. Deep penetration missions to the Ruhr and beyond became feasible with fewer losses to fuel starvation. The cumulative effect was strategic, invisible but decisive. For the mechanics, however, nothing changed. They continued their work in silence under the hum of generators and the sting of paraffin fumes. They watched aircraft return, sometimes crippled, sometimes barely aloft. They rarely heard the thanks of those they had saved, yet they understood their contribution in the simplest measure of all: survival. Wartime secrecy meant that these experiments remained confined to whispers. The RAF's technical divisions would not formally adopt the changes. The chemists at Farnborough and the Petroleum Board would never confirm them. Yet the practice persisted, spread, and subtly influenced post-war fuel formulations. Rolls-Royce engineers examining wartime engine data in 1945 noted the consistent endurance of bomber Merlins. Despite high-stress operations, data that would inform later research into high-octane blends, used for the Griffin and later jet engines. It was an indirect legacy, one that linked the illicit actions of field mechanics to the scientific progress of peacetime. But for those who lived through it, the aftermath was not measured in data. It was human. Each bomber that landed safely carried men who might otherwise have been lost to the sea or to fire. Each crew that returned whole preserved knowledge, morale, and faith in the endurance of their machines. Britain's victory in the air was built not only on industrial production or high command, but on the quiet defiance of individuals who refused to let regulations define possibility. By 1943, the RAF's bombing campaign had become the central instrument of Britain's offensive power. New aircraft, the Lancaster above all, had inherited the lessons of the earlier, leaner years. Better engines, higher octane fuel, and improved aerodynamics extended the range officially. Yet at its heart, the spirit remained the same: an insistence that human ingenuity could stretch the limits of machinery. And in that sense, the illegal fuel mix was not a breach of discipline, but a rehearsal for the future, the first sign that necessity and invention could coexist quietly beneath the roar of war. The war's machinery moved on. But in the maintenance huts and workshops of Bomber Command, the memory lingered, of nights when courage was measured not in medals or sorties, but in the delicate turn of a wrench, the swirl of a funnel, and the faint smell of something slightly different in the air. By the closing months of 1944, the RAF's strategic bombing campaign had transformed beyond recognition. The great industrial cities of Germany, Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, bore the scars of relentless air assault. The path to that destructive capacity had been paved not only by command decisions and factory output, but by the quiet technical evolution that began in the shadows. The illicit blend of 1942 had long since disappeared from the record books. Yet its influence ran deeper than anyone could admit. Engineers from the Petroleum Warfare Department, when questioned after the war, spoke obliquely of unorthodox methods that advanced field understanding. It was an understated acknowledgement, the sort preferred by British institutions, that the frontier of innovation had not been confined to laboratories. Those who had mixed the first contraband barrels did not speak of their actions. They had no desire for attention, and even less for reprimand. For most, their satisfaction lay in what had followed: bombers returning where they once would have failed, missions completed where the odds had been prohibitive. In the official histories published in the early 1950s, their names do not appear. But among the men of the maintenance sections, their reputations endured. He could coax another 50 miles out of a tank, one veteran recalled to the Imperial War Museum in 1978. Didn't ask how, just said thank you. As peace returned, Britain began to gather the technical lessons of total war. Reports were compiled at Farnborough, Cambridge, and the Shell Research Laboratories. The conclusion, phrased with characteristic restraint, read, field improvisations, though unauthorized, materially contributed to the advancement of aero-engine fuel technology. What had once been an act of disobedience was now recorded, quietly as scientific progress. In civilian life, the legacy of those war-borne fuels reached into the future. Research into high-octane aviation blends fed directly into the development of post-war jet fuel standards, kerosene derivatives that powered Britain's first generation of jet aircraft. The Meteor, the Vampire, and the Canberra. The chemistry of speed and endurance had changed permanently, and beyond the science there remained something more human. The story of the mechanic and his mixture embodied a particular kind of wartime courage, understated, practical, and morally complex. Britain's wartime history is filled with tales of visible heroism: the pilot's dive, the rescuer's run, the sailor's endurance. Yet the quieter acts, those performed under flickering lamps in cold dispersals, were no less vital. They defined a spirit of resistance that was technical as much as emotional. By 1945, the RAF's aircraft could reach any point in the Reich, but the distance traveled was not measured in miles alone. It was measured in understanding, in the knowledge that the limits imposed by machinery, regulation, or circumstance were never final. After the war, many of the ground engineers returned to civilian garages, workshops, and factories. Few spoke of what they had done, and fewer still thought of it as heroism. Yet the habit of quiet innovation persisted. Britain's post-war engineering renaissance, from jet propulsion to Formula One, owed something to the generation who, in the blacked-out years of war, learned that precision and courage could coexist in the same pair of hands. When the official history of Bomber Command was published in 1961, it made no mention of unauthorized fuel blends. It could not. But buried in the appendices of a Petroleum Board report, file AIR, TON 314 at the National Archives, a single note remains. Field adaptation of mixtures for operational extension proved effective, though outside approved limits. No names, no details. Just a hint, preserved on paper, of the unseen defiance that helped Britain reach Berlin and return. In the end, the act was not rebellion. It was faith. Faith in skill, in judgment, and in the machinery that carried the hopes of a nation. It was the kind of quiet defiance that defined Britain at war. Practical, disciplined and utterly determined to endure. War, at its heart, is a contest of endurance, not only of armies and machines, but of minds and morals. In the story of one mechanic's illegal fuel mix lies a truth that defined Britain's wartime spirit. That ingenuity, born of necessity, can become an act of national survival. His work was never celebrated in dispatches or mentioned in the histories read by ministers. Yet without such quiet defiance, the machines of war would have faltered. The courage to question, to experiment, to trust one's own craft in the face of regulation. This was a different kind of bravery, the kind that never sought the limelight. The RAF's power did not rest solely on the Spitfire's silhouette or the Lancaster's wingspan. It rested on the thousands of unseen hands that sustained them, fitters, riggers, armorers, and chemists, each playing their part beneath the noise of the war above. Their work was the spine of the effort, the bridge between invention and endurance. In the silence that followed victory, such stories faded quickly. Britain moved on, rebuilt, and rarely looked back at the makeshift solutions that had carried her through the storm. Yet these were the moments that revealed the nation's true character, not reckless but resolute, not loud but steadfast. Today the archive records only fragments, a faint annotation in an engineering ledger, a remark in a veteran's interview, a blurred photograph of a mechanic standing by a fuel drum. But these remnants speak volumes. They remind us that progress often begins not in grand laboratories or conference rooms, but in the determination of ordinary men to make something work, when failure is not an option. The bombs have long ceased to fall, but the spirit that drove that impossible return from Berlin endures, a quiet testament to British ingenuity, and to the belief that courage can live as much in a drop of fuel as in the roar of an engine.